Okay, so let's get back to our starting point, and we're actually going to look at the units of production method for depreciation. So remember again, we purchased that equipment on January 1st, and it cost $12,000. We debited equipment for $12,000, and we credited cash for $12,000. So now, we said we must allocate the cost over the useful life. We called that depreciation, and we said there was three methods: straight line, units of production, and double declining balance. And we said we needed to know three things: the cost, the salvage value, and the useful life. Again, now we're going to focus on just the units of production method. Remember we said the cost was $12,000, and then I think we said the salvage value was $1,500, and it had a 5-year useful life. Now, we need to know a slightly different thing here for the units of production. We don't need to know the years in life, we need to know the units of life, because units of production allocates life based on the number of units we anticipate the asset producing. Now, keep in mind, units, for a piece of equipment, units works well. It could be how many plastic bowls did you produce, or how many yards of yarn was created by this machine or can be created. But think about a vehicle. What would be a good unit to use for a vehicle? Well, you'd probably want to use miles. How many miles do you anticipate this car running? And that would be your total life. Or maybe a backhoe. Well, a backhoe doesn't have a concept of miles, but usually heavy equipment does have a concept of hours. So how many hours can we use this asset? So units of production can have different variables there, but it's always in units. It can be units, how many miles, how many units of output, or how many hours it's operated. So different things there. So take a moment. Remember, our cost is $12,000, our salvage value is $1,500, and now we know a useful life of 105,000 units. That's how many units we think this asset will be able to produce. So let's look at year one and let's compare. Remember, last time we had our straight line, we took the cost minus salvage value and we divided by useful life in years, and that gave us $2,100 per year. Well, now units of production is a little bit different. So let's look at what the formula would be for units of production. Well, for units of production, you would still take the cost and subtract out the salvage value. The difference is, for units of production, though, instead of useful life in years, you would actually do the useful life in units. Okay? So in our formula, we would take the cost, $12,000, minus the $1,500 residual or salvage value. That's the same. The difference is, though, we would divide that by 105,000 units. When we do that, our units of production would actually become 10 cents. Now, keep in mind, that is 10 cents not per year. That is actually 10 cents per unit. So, we take the cost of the asset minus the salvage value divided by the useful life in units. And in this case, we come up to 10 cents per unit produced. So in order to actually calculate here, we must know how many units we produced every single year of the asset's life. So let's create a little chart and see. In year one, we actually produced 15,000 units. Year two, we produced 20,000 units. Year three, we produced 25,000 units. Year four, we produced 35,000. And then in year five, we produced 15,000 units. Okay? So in order to get our depreciation each year, let's look at year one. We produced 15,000 units. We know that it's 10 cents per unit. So you would take the 15,000 units produced times the 0.1 or 10 cents, and that would equal an expense of $1,500 for that year. Again, we said accumulated depreciation is the sum of all year's expenses. So if we had zero expense to start with, we add $1,500 to it. Our accumulated depreciation at the moment is $1,500. So let's look at year two. What do we need to do for year two? Absolutely, we'd simply take the 20,000 units produced and multiply it by the 10%, 0.1, 10 cents per unit. That gives us 2,000. Now, what would be our accumulated depreciation? Well, we had 1,500 before. We're going to add 2,000 to it, so our accumulated is now 3,500. So now year three, again, we do the same thing. We take 25,000 times 10, 10 cents, gives us 2,500. Our accumulated is 6,000. Try and do year four. Pause the video and try year four on your own. All right, so year 4, you take the 35,000 times 0.1 and get 3,500. That would bring our accumulated depreciation to 9,500. We had 6,000, we added 3,500 more. Now let's talk about year 5. The first thing we have to watch is to make sure we do not over-depreciate an asset. Remember, we said this asset had a life of 105,000 units. Well, if you look at this, we actually have produced 110,000 units. Well, we cannot simply take the 15,000 times 10%, or 10 cents. We can't do that. We actually have to bring it in and make sure we don't over depreciate. So even though we produce 15,000 units in year 5, we can only depreciate 10,000 of those units because that gets us to our cap of 105,000. You cannot depreciate an asset beyond its useful life. If you have a useful life of 105,000 units, you can only depreciate the asset for 105,000 units. So we back down and we can only depreciate 10,000 units this year. We again take that times the 0.1 or 10 cents per unit, gives us 1,000. That brings our total accumulated depreciation to 10,500. Now let me give you a little hint. If you fully depreciate an asset, at the end of an asset's life, the book value must equal the salvage value. You're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Well, let's talk about the book value. The book value of an asset equals the cost of the asset minus its accumulated depreciation. So in this example, we know that the asset cost us $12,000. We have accumulated depreciation of $10,500. Remember, that's the total amount at the end. That brings our book value to $1,500 at the end of this asset's life. Does $1,500 equal our salvage value? Absolutely. We had a salvage value of $1,500. Now we've got a book value of $1,500. So make sure you always remember that. If you fully depreciate the asset at the end of the asset's life, the book value must equal the salvage value. Now, how do we record depreciation? Well, again, in this case, we simply go through December 31st. Remember, we purchased the assets on January 1st. We're at the end of our fiscal year, calendar year, December 31st. We would record the debit the same. We'd debit depreciation expense. The method does not impact the entry. It only impacts the dollar amount. And in this case, it would be $1,500. That was the first year of depreciation. Again, we would credit accumulated depreciation, and we credit it for $1,500. Now, since this was units of production, every year our depreciation changed. So how would we record year 2? Well, year 2, again, December 31st of year 2, we would go in. And again, I said that it did not impact the debit and the credit. You always debit depreciation expense. You always credit accumulated depreciation, no matter what method you're using. Where the difference come in is in year 2, we recognize $2,000 in expense. So we're going to debit depreciation expense for $2,000. We're going to credit accumulated depreciation for $2,000.